It's me, Ken Heckenlively, with Twice as Lively, episode 4, entitled I Miss Scott Adams. Yeah, it's nearly June. Scott's been gone since January, and as I listen to the news these days, I just find myself really missing Scott Adams. Now, I want to talk a little bit about all of the wonderful things about Scott, as well as some of the things that I may have disagreed with him, but I always like to hear his voice. So I always like to go back to my writing class that I had with James Fry, the James Fry who wrote How to Write a Damn Good Novel, not the James Fry who uh, embarrassed himself on Oprah Winfrey by faking a drug addiction and how terrible it was. Now, James Fry, who was my teacher for many classes, who wrote How to Write a Damn Good Novel, was just a very wise man. And as we new writers were working with our projects and fragile egos and all those sorts of things, he had this wonderful thing at the beginning, which he said, here's how we're going to critique the work. The way we're going to critique the work is the first thing that's going to happen is for the first 5 minutes, we're just going to talk about what we liked about this person's work. And so I want to start out talking about all of the wonderful things about Scott Adams. So I was introduced to Scott Adams probably in about 2016, 2017 by a family member. And he told me I should watch him. He thought I would find him very interesting. And this was in the Periscope days. I don't know if you remember Periscope. It was one of these new technologies that just kind of sucked, but since it was really cool, you still watched it. And, it actually looked a little bit like a periscope. And what I found myself really enjoying about Scott is that he did his thinking out in the open. You didn't have to wonder what he really thought. And those were both good things and bad things. And one of the ideas that he introduced me to very early on was this concept of persuasion. The idea is how do you talk to people in a way that gets them to listen? And one of the things that he talked about was pacing and leading. And so what you have to do is figure out where are people at this moment and how do you create something of a communal experience within the community. And so I always found that interesting. And, the way he started the communal experience was by having a simultaneous sip. So I'm not going to have his thing of, take your mug or a glass or chalice or stein with your beverage of your choice. I'm just going to say, hey, it's Twice as Lively with Ken Heckenlively. Let's have some coffee and a conversation. So Scott introduced me to this idea of persuasion. And what he did was he said that Trump, because he was the best persuader and communicator, and that the skills of persuasion matter a great deal. And I thought that that was a really interesting frame. There were a number of other things that Scott did that I thought were really interesting. He wasn't afraid to share what he thought, but there were some other habits that he had, which I find very commendable. One of the habits was, can you say something good about somebody you disagree with? I think that that's a wonderful thing. And I find myself practicing that all the time because I find that the news delights in making the other guy look like the devil. And, you know, there are some devils that you should definitely avoid, but most people are not devils. Okay. So they may have different opinions. They may have different senses of morality, which you may find objectionable. But just to check yourself, it's probably a good idea if you try to say some good things about people that you dislike. For example, I live in California, and I think California is being ruined by Gavin Newsom. But yet, I will say some good things about Gavin Newsom. And I'll say some things that are very particular. One of my good friends went to high school with Gavin Newsom. And some of you may not know that Gavin Newsom really struggled with reading. I mean, he was put in the remedial classes. Now, commentators on the right will make fun of that. He's not that smart and everything. That's not it. Gavin Newsom is very smart. Um, but he was picked on in high school. And my friend was actually a grade or two in front of Gavin and was one of the popular people. And Gavin Newsom really struggled when he was in school. He was really picked on. And when Gavin Newsom started making a name for himself, particularly when he became mayor of San Francisco or was running for mayor of San Francisco, he reached out to my friend and he said, "I'd really like you to work on my campaign." And my friend was a little bit, surprised by that. And he says, "Gavin, yeah, I knew you in high school, but uh, it's not like we were really good friends. Why did you want me to come work with you?" And Gavin replied, "Well, you were one of the popular kids, and you were never mean to me. You were always nice." And my friend has continued to work for Gavin in various capacities over the years, and so to my friend, Gavin is a person who rewards loyalty and who he has some personal affinity for, and Gavin had a number of academic challenges, and it really is commendable that he has risen to the position that he is. And I would say that Gavin Newsom, despite my dislike of him, I have to say he is one of the most politically talented people of our time. And if he can get through the Democratic gauntlet, I think he would be a formidable challenge in 2028. So there's me telling you what I like about Gavin Newsom, somebody who I don't think should be governor of my state and who I think has done a lot of harmful things to my state. For example, Gavin Newsom is the reason I can't go into a CVS and just pick up a box of razors. I have to go to the attendant and say, "Will you please unlock the razors because I can't get to them like I've been able to do for most of my life." Because in California, crime is legal now if you want to steal under $1,000. So that's what Gavin Newsom has done. So I don't like what Gavin Newsom has done to my wonderful state, but I do have some good things to say about Gavin Newsom. Okay, what other things did Scott do that I liked? Um, I think he did a really good job of bringing people along and being provocative. And I was always interested in his take on things. And I really miss his voice at this time because I'd like to know what he thinks about Trump going to war with Iran. Would Scott be joining the chorus of people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Ian Carroll, others, or would he be saying, "Give it a little time"? I have a feeling that Scott would have said, "You know, there have been a couple times where Trump did something that I didn't think made sense. And after a couple weeks or a couple months, I found myself going, oh, that's what was going on. I don't know what Scott would have said, but I would have really enjoyed hearing his comments on it. Or would he have said, hey, you've had a great run, and every fighter eventually, gets knocked to the canvas, and this is not good for you. I don't know where he would have come down, but I would have really been interested for Scott to be around to um, to share those thoughts. Okay, so I'm really a little bit troubled on how to go this next segment. I'm worried about the transition, but let me just go into it. So I'm podcasting from Pleasanton, the same town where Scott lived. Yes, for 10 years, I listened to Scott Adams, and he lived in the next town over. And while I thought very well of him, while I was a daily listener, both my wife and I were daily listeners, there were some things that I thought Scott got wrong. And I come here to praise Scott, and also to tell you and to say I think I am a graduate of the Scott Adams School of Persuasion. I consider, after watching him for several thousand hours, that I should say that I have a doctorate in Scott Adams' studies of persuasion. But with all that being said, the disciples, if you will, of a great leader like Scott will have somewhat different takes. And that is normal and natural. And I think Scott would approve of that. So, with all of the wonderful things that I loved about Scott, and I miss him every day, I want to talk a little bit about how I want my show to be different than his show. And if that attracts his former fans who are looking for a new home, that's great. If those differences are something that are just too much, well, thanks for listening to me so far. Okay, so comment number one, or criticism number one about Scott. He always talked about presentation, about looking the part. And I always found myself saying, why do you come in front of us in those crummy t shirts looking like a bum? All right. Yes, you would talk about how in today's world, a man who is a 6 in looks can start to take care of himself and easily become an 8, maybe a 9. But every day you appeared in front of us, you were closer to a 6 than an 8. My dear fans, I will always be dressed stylish for you. Okay? Just because it's a self respect thing. And if I'm talking about looks and trying to do the very best with what you have, it seems to me that I should exemplify that. So I'm always going to try to look attractive for my audience. Okay? One of my differences with Scott. Okay. Criticism number two, Scott's views on men and women. Okay. I loved Scott's views on how to be successful in business. Okay. So he did this great bit where he said, okay, Here's how you get your boss to always think you're doing a great job. Whenever your boss sees you, you say something and they ask you, "Hey, how you doing?" You go, putting out fires and fighting alligators. Putting out fires and fighting alligators." And I got it. And it was funny because it's true. That's the kind of crap you need to say to a boss who really isn't paying attention to make them think, "Oh, that guy's just doing a great job." So you always kind of look a little bit bothered and you say things like, I'm putting out fires and fighting alligators. Okay, got it. Uh, I'm not that guy, that's a little bit of lying to me. So maybe that has hurt me. Maybe that would have been good if I did that more in my career, but I'm sorry. I'm just kind of a happy, bouncy guy. Um, but then I found myself saying, well, Scott, if you did such a good job telling the boss what he wants to hear, couldn't you figure out the opposite sex? Was that so hard? Because when it came to women, I just couldn't believe that such a smart man was so stupid. Because I heard him say things like, you know, women, you just can't make them happy. The minute you make them happy, there's another problem that comes up. I found myself going, Scott, do you not understand the dance? The dance between men and women is that, yes, women have problems because they focus on things a little bit more closely than men do. And, I'll kind of trust a woman more than a man to let me know whether things are going right. But that's the dance. Now, to be fair, I think one of the problems with modern feminism is that it has taught women they never should look happy in the presence of a man. Okay. So, one of the things that feminism removed from women is their agreeableness. I mean, the wonderful thing about a woman who is fully in charge of herself is when a man does something good to be happy for a while. That's okay. That's the way it used to be. Okay. And I think that's what's natural. And so um, if Scott had said something like, hey, modern feminism has told women that in the presence of men, they must have an eternal scowl. And that's the only way that you should interact with a man. No. And if Scott had said something like that, I would have said, okay, Scott, you got it. That's the level of sophistication which is appropriate for a man of your intelligence. But no, he just did the kind of shit which is like, women, you can't make them happy. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. It's just not helping. All right. So, another area of criticism number 3 on Scott was I hated how he talked about the 25% who always have a different opinion. Okay. He would call them the idiot 25%. Here's my perspective. Most species on Earth have one of two survival strategies. They are all loners or they are social creatures. Okay. Human beings are unique in that we have both. We have 75% of the population who will salute pretty much anything any leader tells them to do, because that just seems like the natural order of things. There's 25% of us, and I put me in that category, who pretty much question everything. Okay. And we don't want to be defiant. We just think that you need to explain yourself. Okay. So when Scott would say, oh, there's 25% who are always going to be wrong, I say, no, there's 25% of the population who are going to make sure that humanity survives. Okay? Because have you seen what leaders have tried to get their people to do throughout history? Okay? So 25% of us who always have questions, we're the ones who keep the species alive and hopefully with some sense of dignity. So it's not the idiot 25%, it's the thoughtful 25%. The 25% who say, hey, can you give me a little more information on that? I'm just going to need a little bit more before I sign up. Is that too much to ask from our leaders? I don't think so. Okay, criticism number 4, whistleblowers. So I've written 20 books, mostly with whistleblowers. So I hear Scott talk about whistleblowers, and I just want to pound my head against a wall. And Scott's view of whistleblowers is, well, they're making trouble and, they're going to have a nice payday after that. And that's why they're doing it. No, the route to riches is not to be a whistleblower. Okay. What happens to whistleblowers? Well, they often end up driving Ubers and DoorDashes because nobody wants to deal with them. Blowing the whistle is not a path to making friends, it's a path to being on your own. Of all the whistleblowers that I have worked with, the only one whose life got better was David Johnson, who I wrote the book on DEI with. And that was because James O'Keefe at Project Veritas had the foresight, after seeing what happened to whistleblowers, that when he released the videos that were seen by millions of people, he would set up a Give, Send, Go account so that the people who watched the video, it's usually a couple million people, that a bunch of people would say, hey, I want to donate to that guy because I know the next couple years of his life are going to suck, which is really also what happened to David Johnson. It took him about, I think, 6-9 months to really get a new job, but he had a couple $100,000 in his account. So he was able to make it work. So, Scott, the idea that whistleblowers are going to have an easy life after they blow the whistle, no, their lives are going to be ruined for several years. Now, what I'll also say is that all the whistleblowers that I've worked with, even though they endured several painful years, they have so much self-respect. They and when I've asked them, would you do it again? Every one of them. There is something about being honest that is just good for the soul. And so, yes, blow the whistle, save your soul. Yeah, it will probably wreck your bank account. So please have a backup plan. But we need to move society forward. We ask people to be firemen, we ask people to be cops, we ask them to be soldiers and to sacrifice their lives if necessary. And we have to put whistleblowers in exactly that same category. Okay, criticism number 5, is it on vaccines? Okay, this gets into a bigger discussion because I've written about the vaccine issue. And one of the things that a lot of people miss is that when a number of people observe a series of situations which do not comport with generally accepted beliefs, there is a tendency to disbelieve them. Now, let me talk about an example from my own life. So, I went to Catholic schools. I went to a Catholic high school. I went to a Catholic college. I was considering joining a religious order. I really looked up to the clergy who ran my high school and my college. Around that time, there were also allegations that some of the clergy were abusing students. I was not one of the people who jumped on that bandwagon. I thought those stories were overblown. Um, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit that it took me a long time to come to realize that not only were individual members of the clergy abusing my fellow students, but that the administration was actively covering it up. That is something I continue to think about. So when I hear, when I heard allegations and had my own experiences with vaccines, um, I understood that those who might not believe that carry risks would be very much like I was when dealing with sexual abuse by the Catholic clergy. So I give those people grace because I ask for grace myself on those things I didn't believe. And when Scott was considering getting the COVID shot, uh, I knew where he lived. I did go up to his mailbox and I put information in his mailbox, which would have hopefully made him think twice about getting that COVID shot. I have no idea whether that COVID shot caused the turbo cancer, his prostate cancer to accelerate so rapidly. I have my suspicions about that because I've heard that story a great deal. Um, but I did try to get him not to take that shot. And I don't know if that's what ended up killing him, but I just knew that if I didn't take the opportunity to try and dissuade him from doing that, that I would regret it. So um, it made me feel very sad. I was not one of those people who, when he took the shot and people started calling him Clot Adams, I didn't like that. Um, I did go on Twitter and say very publicly that although I am known as one of the people who doesn't think the truth is being told about vaccines, that I found Scott to be the most truthful person on the struggle that he was having about the COVID vaccines. So I publicly defended him. Um, he never responded to me in any way. Uh, I had sent him several letters because when Plague of Corruption became popular in 2020, um, I was the subject of some discussion in the news, and I actually tried to get on his show, and very publicly he said, "No, I'm not going to have Ken Heckenlively on my show. I, I I can only ask," and it was his show, so he was free to have me on or not. And but I always found him to be, respectful, even though he didn't agree, and even though I think he made some bad decisions. Which brings me to, I think it's criticism number 7 on UFOs. And this isn't quite a criticism, it's more something I wish that he was around for. And that is, I really wish Scott Adams was around to talk about what's going on with the UFO issue. And so while I may have disagreed with Scott on the way he presented himself, his views on men and women, the 25% defiance of the population, whistleblowers, vaccines, I would really have been intrigued as to what he would have made of the continuing revelations about UFOs and what's going on. Because Scott was so open to sharing everything in the public domain, he could also change his mind on things. And so I really would have loved to hear what he had to say about it. And I think, like most of you, what Scott really left us with is that feeling of sadness we have when a really good friend leaves us. And the reason that we're so sad is that that person was so authentic with us. And he was so authentic that he did become, as he wanted to become, the digital best friend for so many of us, especially during COVID. And I think that the lesson that Scott taught us is that the way he spoke to us online is probably the way we need to start talking to each other in person. And so I am really trying to do that also in my personal life, which is to speak genuinely, speak kindly, but also to share the differences I may have with people and the different perspectives I have. And so I'm really hopeful that my podcast will be something that in this environment, this online environment, will be something that you enjoy. But I'm also hopeful that it will spill over into your personal life and that some of these ideas, some of these observations may help you in your life. So, with that, I raise my coffee cup to Scott. Scott, I miss you. Um, I hope that you are in a good place. I know that you converted shortly before your death, and that some of the people who claim to have who knew you well claim that they received messages from you saying that there was surprisingly good news. So, with that, Scott, I just want to say thank you for all that you gave us. And at least for me, I'm going to try to continue the conversations with the public uh, with your spirit. So, cheers, everybody. Now get out